In the last video, we talked about various examples of habitat destruction as a way that humans affect biodiversity worldwide. In this video, we'll talk about overharvesting and overexploitation. Both of these terms refer to pulling some sort of resource away from the environment faster than that resource can naturally replenish itself. So if we're talking about a sustainable resource, what should be hypothetically at least a sustainable resource, that is, it can replenish itself. So for example, venison, right? Deer, you can hunt them and remove them from the forest and consume them for your own purposes, feed a family, and because they are biological organisms, they reproduce, and if you are hunting them at the same rate that they are reproducing, the overall population is not going to decrease, and therefore it is a renewable, sustainable resource. Overharvesting would be hunting them to the point where the death rate for the population is higher than the birth rate of that population. And year after year after year, if that continues to be true, the overall population will decrease because the population size of any year is going to be the population of the previous year minus deaths plus births. So if deaths is bigger, the whole population will gradually decrease. Overharvesting specifically refers to living organisms, so plants and animals and fungi that are pulled out of the ecosystem. Overexploitation is more of a general term. It could apply to overharvesting, but it could also apply to, say, mineral resources or water or any other type of natural resource we could discuss. Now, I used hunting deer as an example because we have lots of deer in Pennsylvania. That's part of a lot of our experience. But the deer population in Pennsylvania in general is not in any kind of danger. They have been hunted rather low, but they repopulate relatively fast, and we issue hunting licenses every year, and we regulate hunting in order to manage their overall population size. And honestly, the hunters do a pretty good ecological service, making sure that their population doesn't spike so high that they would eat themselves to starvation. When we are talking about overharvesting, there are lots of different versions of it. One of the first ones that's going to spring to mind is poaching. So poaching is the illegal hunting of organisms, of animals, often of endangered species, in fact, because there is a black market, an illegal black market for body parts, pelts, or in this picture you can see tusks, elephant tusks, for pieces of endangered species for a number of reasons. One, for wealthy collectors that just want to purchase them as status items, so tiger skin rug or something like that, or upholstery made with tiger skin, or they just want something made out of ivory, crafted from ivory as a some sort of artifact or souvenir that they would like to create. It's a rare material for very obvious reasons. There's a big black market for it. There's also a lot of folklore associated with many endangered animals in terms of folk medicine. So there are thoughts that if you take tiger bones or tiger teeth or something like that, you grind it up, that it can have some medicinal properties and it will increase virility because a tiger is a very strong creature, so it could increase your own strength and power, and it obviously doesn't work because it's powdered bone and teeth. But that it doesn't matter that it doesn't work. People think it works, or that someone has suggested that it might, and the notion that it might work is powerful enough to fuel demand in this black market. That's actually true in just all marketing. It doesn't actually matter if a claim is true. Just if you say it and people believe it, that's enough to sell the product. The problem with black market, one of the many, many problems with black market, is that there is no regulation about what you are and are not allowed to say about your products. So some of those problems are actually exacerbated. Add on to that the fact that these are endangered species, many of them, which means that supply of these parts is necessarily very, very low. These are rare parts which would take a lot of work, poaching, in order to go find and procure at great risk to the poachers because, it's extremely illegal, and they will be arrested with massive fines or potentially very long jail sentences if they are caught. So that jacks up the price for each one of these components, which makes it even more lucrative for those organizations that have found some sort of method of getting around those laws and restrictions. I've seen quite a few movies where they depict poachers, and they are frequently depicted as like some local farmers or something that said, hey, there's a rare animal somewhere nearby, and we could really get some money for ourselves if we were to poach it and sell it. And that's not how poaching works. If you are in possession of an extremely illegal product, you can't just walk up to someone and try to sell it. You have to take using some mafia type terminology here, you would have to take it to what's called a fence, right? You need to take it to someone who can actually trade in illegal goods. And the only kinds of people who have access to that network are large organized cartels. So poaching is usually conducted by these extremely massive poaching cartels that trade in illegal animals. So you can see here that this is not tusks and ivory taken from a single elephant. These are from what appears to be hundreds of elephants, and this was seized in a bust of one of these poaching cartels. Same here with these tiger pelts. This is one of the tiger pelts that they seized. Each one of these tiger pelts worth about $20,000 on the black market. All of this ivory together worth about $30 million total. So this is not individual farmers that are trying to get some money for a village or anything like this. These are large criminal organizations that conduct this kind of business. Now, around this pile of ivory, you see some firemen, and the reason for that is once you collect all that ivory, what are you going to do with it? You can't just the government is just going to keep it in a warehouse? Are they going to sell it themselves and profit from this extremely illegal trade? Donate it to a museum, which is more ethically on the up and up, but in a way, philosophically, that's kind of like profiting off the thing. I would kind of promote the donate it to a museum policy, but here's what they did is they sent a message about the zero tolerance approach on poaching, and they set this giant pile of ivory on fire to destroy it. The government was not going to profit from it. No one was going to see any benefit from it. We're not going to leave any room for suggestions of corruption or anything like that. If we collect this, we will destroy it, and all your profits will go up in flames along with it. So that is what they did, and it's a bold move because ivory doesn't burn. So they had to get the fire up to an extremely high temperature before all of this material would be destroyed, because the ivory itself was not going to just combust. Similar picture over here. I think I showed you this in one of our first slides. This is a mountain of buffalo skulls. So this is from the American bison. And you could see how many bison were killed in order to create this giant pile. And they were killed for meat. They were killed for their pelts. They were killed for sport, a lot of them. And as I may have mentioned, we didn't think that animals could go extinct. The notion had occurred to us, like academics had thought about it, but the idea that it was an actual risk just wasn't in our heads, that we could drive a species to extinction, and that drove this kind of behavior, or it allowed it to move on unchecked. And we almost did drive the American bison to extinction. They now exist in natural preserves. Down here I have a few other species listed. Whales. So burning wood was our main source of heat and light for a very long time. And in order to get enough wood, you need to cut down forests, right? And we were deforesting all across Europe. We're cutting down forests. And it's an ecological disaster, right? We are over harvesting the forests. We're cutting down the trees, and that slowed down once we had a technological revolution and we developed a brand new energy technology, which was whale oil. But then we moved on to start over harvesting whales. So whaling became a big industry. But remember from when we were talking about population ecology, the difference between equilibrial species and opportunistic species, between R-selected and K-selected population growth curves. Whales are a very equilibrial species. They have a slow growth pattern. They have a very small number of calves, usually one calf, and it takes them a long time to reach reproductive maturity. So their overall rate of population growth is slow, and our rate of consumption, our rate of harvesting, was very high. So we drove their populations to near extinction in many areas, and whaling is actually still a problem in some locations. Now, I also have Galapagos tortoises mentioned here. Galapagos tortoises, again, very slow reproducing, take a long time to reach sexual maturity, very long-lived organisms, so it's okay that they take a long time to reach sexual maturity, because every one of those Galapagos tortoises is going to have a very long life and lots of opportunities to have more offspring. But every tortoise that you remove from the islands, and the islands, since the islands are relatively small, it's a necessarily small population of tortoises, is going to substantially reduce the rate at which you are reproducing, that you are renewing the number of new tortoises. And ships used to take tortoises and they would kind of herd them on board. They would corral them, walk up a plank to get onto the boat. Seems weird, right? Why would you want a live Galapagos tortoise on your boat that you're sailing around on? Well, if you're a sailor out at sea, you want to make sure that you are getting well fed. You're going to have a lot of salted beef on hand, because salt is a preservative. You're going to have this intensely salted meat preserved and ready to go. You'll have some citrus fruits around. They might go bad over time, but that's going to get you your vitamin C. You're going to have barrels of water. So there's all these considerations about how you're going to store your food and how long it's going to be able to be preserved and when you can refuel up and all of that. Tortoises are enormous creatures, lots of meat on them, and generally pretty docile. Very easy to manage. If the ship gets tossed in a storm, they have a low center of gravity. They're not going to go flying overboard or anything like that. So they can just be kept on the ship for a pretty extended period of time. They don't even need to be fed like that. They have a pretty slow metabolism. It's not like a cow that's going to keel over pretty fast. So by keeping a live tortoise on board, you have preserved meat for an extended period of time that you didn't have to oversalt or anything like that, which would then increase how much water you want to be drinking. So we used to just kind of take them on board as a food resource. But that very much depleted the population of tortoises in the Galapagos. Now, those were all endangered species. What about species that are not yet endangered, but that we are nevertheless over-harvesting, such that at some point in the future they would likely become endangered because of the rate that we are pulling them out? Can we slow down the rate that we are pulling them out of the environment, that we are harvesting them from the ecosystem, to the point where we would be able to get the maximum amount of resources from that population, but still allow it to be able to replenish itself? And the answer is yes, we can. The follow-up question would be, how would we know how fast that rate is? At what point are we going to be able to maximize our profit from some population? Because again, this always is going to come back to economics, but still have it be removed sustainably from the ecosystem. We are not depleting the resource, but we are profiting at the maximum amount from the resource. Notice once again, we have an environmental problem and we are looking for an economic solution, because environmental problems are economic problems and therefore they will have economic solutions. what is the reason we stopped harvesting forests, right, when I was talking about it earlier, as intensely as we were for the wood? Why did we stop chopping them down in Europe at that rate? It's because we started using coal and whale oil as an energy resource instead. We shifted our economic focus because that was the more cheap and abundant fuel source. It was more efficient that way. So economics drives our decision-making processes. So let's see what we can do with economics to inform our choices here. This curve should look familiar to you, this S-shaped growth curve. This is a logistic growth curve. So this models some population, when it's very small, growing exponentially at first, getting a J-shaped growth curve and growing faster and faster and faster. And then as competition for resources increases, the growth slows down and then levels off at that carrying capacity, right? Well, if the growth is fastest when the population is small and slowest when it's up at carrying capacity, that tells you that if you start removing organisms from the environment, their growth rate is actually going to depend on what their current population level is. So if you harvest them down to this point right here, you harvest the population down to 1/2 of the carrying capacity, this is the maximum population growth rate on this curve. You see that? That's where the angle of this curve is the most dramatic. And if you can harvest some population of interest down to exactly that population level, you should be able to remove members of that species, members of that population, at that rate, such that you're keeping the population at that level. And if they're replacing themselves at that speed, it should stay right there. So that would be the maximum amount of profit, the maximum amount of harvesting you could do, which is still sustainable. That's the sweet spot right there. So that's sustainable resource management. You use a population ecologist to come in, calculate the carrying capacity, and then figure out what the exact rate of harvesting you could do year to year is without damaging the overall population and driving it towards extinction. And it turns out it's just 1/2 the carrying capacity. It's actually relatively simple once you figure out what the carrying capacity is. That part's hard, but for us, it's pretty simple. Up here I have a picture of bluefin tuna. This is a species that we over-harvested quite a bit, to the point where we were sending out more and more boats, but we were getting less and less tuna year after year after year. And they said, what's going on? Why we're sending out more boats, more fishermen, and we're incurring costs, right? It's becoming more and more expensive for us to do this, and we're not getting as much profit out. So it's becoming a money sink to look for these, but this is our whole industry. And they talked to an ecologist, and the ecologist said, hey, listen, look for other types of fish. Go fishing for other types of fish for a few years. Let the population recover to 1/2 K. Then go back to fishing for the tuna, but only take them out at this speed. And they listened to him. At least they listened to him a little bit. And when they came back, the populations of tuna had replenished themselves, and they were able to increase their profits. As I've said many occasions before, if you only focus on the short term, then environmentalism and economics often seem to be at odds with each other. But if you look at the big picture, long term, what is the best for sustainable growth, then frequently the best ecological decision will also be the best economic decision. The exotic bird trade is another example of this. Frequently, a lot of the colorful parrots and things like that you see in some pet stores, what people do is in the ecosystems where these birds live, they will capture the parents, the adult birds, and then they will market those. But that means that any eggs that were left in a nest are not going to have any parents to take care of them, and they will probably not survive to adulthood. So you're depleting all of the reproductive population, everyone that could replenish the number of birds in that ecosystem. And the number of new offspring are also getting a higher mortality rate. So increasing the number of deaths, decreasing the number of births, and as a result, the population plummets. The correct or a better approach, I should say, just from a strictly economic perspective, a better approach would be to harvest the eggs and leave the reproductive adults, who could then make more eggs and produce more offspring, and that would allow the population to recover much more quickly, and that would be more sustainable. Whether or not that's an ethical thing to do is an entirely different conversation, but that would at least be a more sustainable decision.